EHS Today webcast, Winter Weather, What to Expect and How to Prepare, sponsored by AlertMedia. I'm Dave Blanchard. I'm the editor-in-chief of EHS Today, the host of today's event. Moderating today's event is Katie Goen. She's the senior producer with AlertMedia. I'm going to turn it over to her. So Katie, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Dave. I'm so glad to be here to moderate today's webinar, and I'm glad you all joined us to get a sneak peek of the winter season ahead, so you know, of course, what to expect in terms of weather, but also how to prepare your people and your business. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. First, we have Sara Pratley joining us. Sara is the Vice President of Global Intelligence at AlertMedia, and she leads a team of experienced analysts to monitor emerging threats and incidents worldwide. And before joining AlertMedia, Sara was the Vice President of National News for CNN's domestic news gathering unit. So she led the network's coverage of many major events, such as the Boston Marathon bombings, Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, several destructive natural disasters, and many, many more. And during her decade at the network, she gained this really unique ability to assess, decipher, and analyze information quickly, which is a skill set she now applies to her role at AlertMedia. So we are very lucky to have her. Hi, Sara. Welcome.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate the warm introduction. Really excited to be here to present today.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here. And I'd also like to welcome Jason Moreland, in-house Senior Meteorologist at AlertMedia. He graduated from the University of South Alabama with a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Meteorology. His professional experience within the private sector, though, includes more than a decade of extensive domestic, international, and offshore forecasting. And throughout his career, Jason has provided really critical decision-making support to a wide range of businesses, live event venues, and even sensitive utility and offshore projects ahead of impending hazardous weather. So that's quite the resume, Jason. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm glad to be here today.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to touch on today's agenda so we all know what to expect over the next 45 minutes or so. First, we're going to review last year's winter season. Then we're going to go over the early season forecast for the 2022-2023 winter season. We're going to talk about some potential impacts of winter weather. And finally, we'll give you some best practices for preparing your people and property. But before we get into any of that, I would like to go ahead and launch our first poll. So I really would love for you guys to participate in all the polls today because it really gives us a better understanding of your primary concerns as we get deeper into the winter season. So the question we're asking right now is, what are your company's primary concerns about the upcoming winter weather season? And you can choose as many as you like here. You don't have to choose just one. So the answer options are property and facility damage, protecting your on-site employees, protecting your dispersed or remote employees, which of course can also include those traveling workers that you might have. Or maybe it's that communication piece of it, communicating before, during, or after a winter storm. Or maybe it's that business continuity post-storm, kind of getting back to normal. So I'm going to give that just a couple more seconds. If you could go ahead and get your answers in, that would be fantastic. And then let's go ahead and share those results because I do want to get Sara and Jason's feedback on what you guys are most concerned about. All right, so let's see. Well, they're all represented here, which is excellent. Obviously, these are all concerns that any business should have, but it looks like we're leading the pack here with protecting those on-site employees, which was answer number 2. So let me start with you, Jason. Is that about what you were expecting or any surprises here at all?
Yeah, I think I'm just glad to see a good bit of diversity because every single one of these are going to be quite important in things that should be considered when making your winter preparedness plans.
And what about you, Sara? Any
absolutely.
Any thoughts or anything to add there?
I would definitely just kind of echo the same. It's good to see that everything is represented. Clearly, there's a lot for all of us to care about when we think about winter weather and all of the impacts, but just really good to see that everybody's kind of thinking in similar directions.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our first section here, and I'm going to pass it over to Jason, and he's going to review last year's winter weather, some trends from the past several years, plus the early season forecast for this year. So, Jason, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. So I figured it would be best to maybe just get a little bit of a feel for what we experienced last year, because it's been a good 6 to 9+ months since we've really had to deal with much in the way of major wintry weather around the country. So what we're looking at with this first slide is a seasonal summary for what we experienced from December of 2021 through February of 2022. And on the left-hand side, you can see that this is a snapshot of the temperatures compared to normal. And really maybe not too much of a surprise here, but a good chunk of the lower 48 of the US was above average for that 3-month span. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of those departures from normal in terms of precipitation. And really, this was not the best winter to early spring for interest in the Southwest U.S. As you all are probably aware of, the Southwest U.S. is dealing with a long-term 22-year mega drought. And it's really the winter and the early spring months where places like California, Nevada, Arizona experience some of their most rainfall for the year. So if you don't get wetting rainfall or heavy snowpack within the Intermountains, it doesn't really bode well for the rest of the season or the rest of 2022. And so that's basically what we've seen was a continuation of the drought over the last 6 to 12 months. And across much of the central and east, it was near normal precipitation. Toward the back end, we saw some elevated rainfall and snow across the Tennessee Valley into the Ohio Valley. But just going back to the temperatures really quickly, one would think that maybe we kind of skirted by without having much in the way of significant winter weather impacts. But in all honesty, it was really just the opposite. We saw quite a number of winter storms and even some embedded severe thunderstorm outbreaks, given the warmer than average temperatures that started off the season. And really, this seasoned out average really kind of cancels out some of the more significant cooler temperatures that we saw during January and February. It was really just December that was well above normal. We had at least 15 to and upwards of 20 states that had their warmest December on record. And that was really supported by a stronger than average area of high pressure over the central and southeast U.S. But the pattern quickly changed as we headed deeper into January and February, and we saw multiple waves of cold air streaming southward through Canada. So these patterns don't necessarily lock in for 2 to 3 months at a time. We can see significant changes week to week. So just to kind of review some of the more major events that we saw last year, I wanted to start off with more of what we saw during the first part of the winter, and this was into December. As we just saw with the last slide, a lot of the warmer than average winter temperatures that we saw throughout the season was mainly focused towards this first month of winter with those warmer conditions over the Mid-South. And that's really the perfect recipe for significant fall season severe weather. The most significant event occurred around December 10th, December 11th. This was the day in which the Mayfield, Kentucky tornado hit. Just as a quick recap, this was an EF4 violent tornado with maximum winds of 190 miles per hour, almost to near 200 miles per hour, which would have made it an EF5. So I know a lot of times we think about the spring months where, that's where we get the tornadoes in traditional Tornado Alley. But really, if you get these late season warm-ups into the winter, you can have significant outbreaks. So this is something that I just wanted to call into mind here, just so that we don't completely forget about different types of weather threats that we can see over the coming months. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, we saw another similar tornado outbreak in Northeast Texas where there were 2 EF4 tornadoes. So that's just one bit of what we could possibly see over the next couple of months. And then as we advance into the next slide, as we started to see the pattern change for colder conditions setting in across the eastern 2/3 of the country, this is when we started to see widespread, large-scale, multi-state winter weather episodes. And we saw exactly this in mid-January. You can see on the map to the left, this is a display from the National Weather Service. We had winter weather advisories, which were in purple, and those winter storm warnings, which are in pink, extend from the Mid-South, including states including Arkansas, northern Mississippi, Tennessee, and then this same storm system continued northeast through the Appalachians on into the Northeast U.S. And even down toward the bottom right, you can see that narrow sliver of dark purple colors over South Carolina. That's where there was a major ice storm event. So there's multiple hazards that are usually ongoing with each and every one of these large-scale weather systems. This also extended well into the Deep South. As you can see on the slide, at least a handful of different states in the Mid-South were experiencing a state of emergency type conditions, and there were at least 5 confirmed deaths as a result of this winter storm. Then as we get into late January, really there wasn't a whole lot happening in the Northeast until we got into the mid to latter half of the winter. And sure enough, we ended up with a Boston blizzard. We went from not having much in the way of winter season snowfall to then having a day in which we tied the record daily snowfall for the Boston metro. So even if your winter kind of starts off a little bit warmer than normal, or you're not seeing much in the way of winter weather hazards, all it takes is one or two of these major winter storm episodes, and that'll be the one thing that sticks with you well after the winter season has come and gone. So even areas that you would expect to see winter storms, you can still see even higher end episodes than what they're used to. And we saw that with this one, where there were state of emergency declarations from Virginia northward all the way into Delaware, Maryland, even into Jersey and Rhode Island, into southern New England. And with that, of course, there's always going to be the issue with travel issues. And during this episode, there were thousands of flight cancellations and whatnot, not just along the I-95, but also well inland, because as you know, we also see these travel impacts usually cascade across the country when these situations come up. And then finally, as we headed deeper into February, you can see here that we had yet another major storm system. And I know that when it comes to winter weather, we often think just about the northern U.S., but look at this event. This was basically related to a weakness in the polar vortex. Now, the polar vortex is something that has gained traction in the media within the last few years, but this isn't a type of weather phenomena that's been with us really forever. But every time we get one of these strong Arctic blasts across the central and eastern U.S., it's actually a weakening of the polar vortex near the North Pole. And when that happens, you see a displacement of cold air that comes out of Canada and the Arctic regions. And that does push southward well into places like Texas, Louisiana, the list goes on. And you can see with this particular event, there was a major ice storm that centered right around Memphis and extended northeast into Kentucky. And there were some locations that were without power for an upwards of 5 to 7 days. So it's not always all about where is the major winter snow going to be, but also these freezing rain, snow gradients that cause some of the biggest issues. And that's what we dealt with this particular storm. So next question may be, how has winter weather changed? And frankly, there have been some notable trends that we've seen, especially across the last 1 to 2 decades. One of those is that warm temperature records are often outpacing the cold temperature records. You're probably hearing more in the news about these record-setting heat waves that can last for days and even weeks on end. And I think that can give a bit of a false sense of security in the winter months where, maybe we don't have to deal with these winter storm events quite as much because it's just always warmer than normal all the time. So, therefore the storm frequency is going to be much less. But honestly, we're seeing a bit of an opposite trend. So when we do see these cold air outbreaks, they're often accompanied by a stronger temperature gradient with warmer air to the south and still cooler temperatures below 32 that are still supportive of wintry weather impacts. So we're seeing more of these frequent displacements of the polar vortex with the jet stream basically dipping farther south into the central and eastern U.S. during those 2 to 3 week cold snaps. And that's when we can still get these significant winter storm events. Another thing that we're going to talk about here in just a moment is lake effect snow. But we're actually seeing signs that the lake effect snow season is lengthening. And part of that is because usually by mid to late winter, the Great Lakes are often frozen solid. You don't really see much of that lake effect enhancement because the moisture source has been cut off, and that basically cancels out your lake effect snow season. But when we're starting the fall and early winter with warmer than average temperatures, we're seeing the enhancement from the lakes really extend deeper into the winter, and that can cause more significant snow events for areas in the Midwest and into the Northeast. And also, maybe one thing that's not so much weather forecast related, but we've seen more municipalities cancel what we used to call snow days, where all the kids were let out of school and you wouldn't have to worry about the curriculum for a couple of days. But now we're going more towards virtual learning ever since the pandemic, and we've seen those snow days canceled in major metros like New York City. So that's just one other thing that you need to prepare for, is what to do with your children if they're at home and they have to be learning, basically in a virtual setting, and you may have to change your plans even during these winter events to still keep the ball rolling there. So that's a bit about how winter weather has changed. Now for just a quick snapshot as to what we're dealing with, especially across the northern half of the country. We're only in mid-November, but it's not unusual to still have big winter weather even a couple weeks before the official meteorological start of the winter months. And as you can see here, we do have a large area of winter weather advisories that span from the northern Rockies all the way into the Northeast. Now, I will say that for areas from central Pennsylvania northeast into Maine. Those alerts that you see have been allowed to expire because the initial disturbance is now moving away from the region. But if you look really closely towards northeast Ohio into western areas of New York, like Buffalo, Watertown, if you have any interest within this region, we have a major, potentially top 5 lake effect snow event that's on tap. We're already seeing some lake effect snow bands starting to develop within this region, but especially Thursday night into Friday, this could be a top 5 event for areas like Buffalo and Watertown. We're talking about potentially upwards of 2 to 3, maybe even locally 4+ feet of snowfall. So I know that for people in Buffalo, you're like all too familiar with major winter storms, but even for Buffalo standards, this is going to be a high-end event. There could be some road closures along the New York Thruway. And this is going to be something that could potentially last well into Saturday and Sunday as well. So just wanted to give some quick attention on that. And then in terms of what we're looking at for the next 6 to 10 days, you can see that at least through the 23rd or 24th, still well below normal temperatures for all areas from virtually the Rockies eastward all the way towards the East Coast. Really no surprise here. We do have a pretty strong dip in the jet stream, and that's why we're seeing some of this more active weather. I will say that as we get deeper towards Thanksgiving, within that Monday through Thursday period, we are likely to see at least a brief warm up across the central and eastern U.S., but also the weather pattern could become even more unsettled as we start to see more of a contrast in temperatures. So be on the lookout, especially not just for Thanksgiving Day, but also that Friday into Saturday. There's some early indications that we could be looking at what could be a large-scale storm system that initially starts off in the southeast, has a lot of rain and thunderstorms, and then starts to work its way off towards the mid-Atlantic and the northeast. And in terms of precipitation, I do expect that when we get some more updates, the southeast is going to start to look wetter over the next 2 weeks, and this eventually is going to filter its way into the northeast part of the country. So in terms of what we're looking at as a whole, beyond just the next couple of weeks, but really for the next 3 to 3.5 months, a lot of the long-term winter season forecasts have been highly based on the expectation of a 3rd consecutive winter of La Niña. And really all La Niña is cooler than normal water temperatures within the equatorial Pacific. And it's been proven that these different changes in the water temperature profile out there to the west of South America can have downstream influences on the jet stream out across the United States and Canada. So every single La Niña is going to be slightly different. I don't want to give the idea that this is exactly what the pattern is going to look like nonstop for the next 3 months, but at least traditionally speaking, on average, La Niña will support more in the way of drier conditions across the southwest U.S. all the way into the southeast. But as you look off toward the north, there's likely going to be multiple cold shots, as we're seeing this week, across the Midwest into the northern plains. And then we're often going to have that traditional battleground that sets up across the Tennessee Valley, extending into the Great Lakes and into portions of the Northeast. So that would be some indication that it could be quite active later on this winter. As we take more of an in-depth look at, this is the Climate Prediction Center forecast. This is the official seasonal outlook from NOAA. You can see that those expectations are reflected pretty well with what we saw on the La Niña slide, with warmer, drier than normal conditions across the Southwest into the Southeast. But again, much like last year, you can have a very warm month followed by 1 to perhaps even 2 cooler than normal months. So I don't want people to get caught up thinking that, oh, we don't have anything to worry about in a place like Little Rock, Memphis, Charlotte. There's going to be times where you're going to experience cooler than normal temperatures, much like this week. And with that, there could be some mixed wintry precipitation. From the Pacific Northwest into the Great Lakes, it does look cooler and wetter than normal. So again, this is looking like a pretty stormy winter weather season. Could be seeing multiple winter storm hazards quite frequently. And then the Northeast is kind of interesting this year. It's a bit of a toss-up. Could be a bit of a battleground, and I think we're going to see maybe a glimpse of that shortly after Thanksgiving. So key takeaways, again, Southwest and Southeast may experience a warmer and drier than average winter. I know this doesn't bode well for interests in California that have concerns about the water supply, especially going into summer 2023. Not to get too far ahead of myself, there are some very early indications that in the Pacific we could start to transition from a La Niña to an El Nino as we get towards the spring into the summer. So if that transition were to happen, perhaps the back half of the winter into the spring could start to trend a little bit wetter, but at least for the next 2 to likely 3 months, the Southwest is going to be mainly on the dry side. Could still see some occasional storm events for sure, especially across Central California into Northern California, but from the regional standpoint, drier than normal. We could also see a continued worsening of drought conditions across the southern plains. So talking about areas from Texas northward into Kansas. And then finally from Great Lakes in the Ohio Valley, still slightly cooler than average temperatures and frequent storm activity. And then with the Northeast, maybe warmer than average as a seasonal standpoint, but multiple cold shots still likely over the next 2 to 3 months.
And Jason, sorry to interrupt, but we have a question coming in that pertains to what you're talking about now. Can cooler waters help manage tornadoes and hurricanes?
So overall, if we were to see cooler than average water temperatures, yes, that would have a negating effect with the total number of tropical storms and hurricanes. But, the one thing is that the cooler than normal waters out there in the Pacific are related to what we're seeing with La Niña, but we're not seeing that across the open waters off the U.S. East Coast. And in fact, oftentimes we're seeing warmer than normal temperatures across the Northeast, and that sharp pressure gradient between these cold air masses coming out of the Great Lakes in Canada, interacting with the warmer than normal Gulf Stream along the I-95 corridor in areas just to the east along the U.S. East Coast. We're actually seeing an intensification of a lot more coastal storm events. And even though we're trending warmer than normal more seasons than not, all it takes is for 32 or around 32 degree temperatures, and you can still have a major winter storm. And then if you've got warmer than normal waters, you're also putting more water vapor into the atmosphere, and that's causing these storms to grow and strengthen more than they have in the past.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that. And great information, Jason. Next, we're going to move on to Sara, who's going to discuss some potential impacts of winter weather so that you can better prepare your people and your organization. So Sara, over to you. What you got?
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it. So yes, unfortunately, there are several potential impacts on your people when we think about winter weather. Some of them are going to be fairly obvious, like the first two here, right? Icy roads and slips, trips, and falls. But others may not necessarily be top of mind, like cold injuries or seasonal disorders. So according to the National Weather Service, 70% of winter deaths are actually caused by auto accidents. 29% of worker compensation claims actually come from wintertime falls. So those are really big numbers and obviously could very seriously impact your in-office or on-site workers as they commute to their locations, enter and exit buildings, or of course your transportation workers during snow and icy conditions. So obviously considering allowing as many of your workers to potentially work remote when that's available and when that's an option is obviously going to help to minimize a lot of those vehicle accidents and probably those slips, trips, and falls as well. And now when it comes to cold injuries, the CDC tells us that prolonged exposure to extreme weather temperatures can really cause cold stress, injuries, and illnesses. We're talking about things like frostbite and hypothermia, trench foot, chilblains. All of those things are really impacts here. So of course, you'll definitely want to consider your outdoor workers and how to best protect them during the winter season. And then finally, winter weather can have an impact on your employees' mental health. I think this is one that goes overlooked very often. But going back to our friends from the National Weather Service, they tell us that 10 million Americans are actually impacted by some form of seasonal affective disorder every year. So that's really the mental health impact based on the seasonal weather. Again, that's a really huge number. You're definitely going to want to make sure that when you're thinking about winter preparedness, that you at least incorporate that into the conversations that you're having with your teams. And remember, even though your offices and your locations may not be located in traditionally cold regions, right? We've got a lot of remote employees now. They're obviously going to be looking for guidance from their organizations if they live in areas that are going to be impacted by winter weather, even if there's not necessarily a main office in those locations. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about some potential impacts on your property. Winter storms often cause power outages, right? That's a huge one. You've got to consider how you'll achieve business continuity if your workers cannot physically do their jobs without electricity, and how they'll communicate and how you'll communicate with them if the power is out. A not so fun fact here, the prolonged record cold temperatures in Texas back in 2021 and our big storm, those actually left 69% of Texans without power. So obviously that's a really big consideration. Frozen and busted pipes are another concern. So when temperatures drop below freezing, right, there's a chance that your pipes will freeze, potentially burst, causing even more, damage and more, confusion. So this can cause flooding, water damage, structural issues. So again, how will your employees work if they're on the office or in the office, or if they're on site or if they're at home, if they're impacted by frozen pipes. So definitely something to be concerned with, as well as in the office with your remote employees. And then there's also been an increase in energy crises over the past few winter seasons, which can really greatly impact your property and your people's property as well. So once again, going back to the winter storm in Texas in 2021, the cold temperatures overwhelmed the power grid and the water treatment plant, really forcing thousands of people to live without heat and water and power for days on end. So if the energy providers are able to keep up with the cold, organizations will still likely be faced with higher utility bills to keep facilities warm and running, right? And as you can see here on the slide, freezes in winter storms can cause upwards of $2.7 billion in damages annually. That's a stat coming to us from NOAA. So obviously minimizing the risk when it comes to winter weather should be a top priority for so many different reasons, right? All right, let's go ahead and talk about some of those secondary impacts that are just as important. So carbon monoxide fatalities can unfortunately be a reality after severe winter weather events. When winter temperatures plummet and home heating systems run for hours, the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning increases quite significantly. And then there are power outages, right? Many people turn to generators for heat and electricity, and sometimes they've not used them properly, or they're maybe not up to date, really, which can result in death and or injuries. So once again, think of your remote employees who may be using generators or running their home heating systems really frequently. When we take data from the CDC and kind of analyze it, they tell us that every year at least 430 people die in the US from accidental CO poisonings, which is just really devastating. And then approximately about 50,000 people in the US visit the emergency room every year due to CO poisoning. So it's definitely something that really needs to be top of mind. And again, not necessarily something that a lot of people would consider when they think about winter weather hazards. Then there's the possibility of injury from snow and ice cleanup. Those could be injuries resulting from shoveling or snow blowers, or even while salting a driveway or scraping off your windshield. Many people also rely on space heaters for additional warmth in the winter, whether at home or in the workplace. I'm guilty of this. And that's a huge fire hazard. Structure fires are common in the winter for this very reason. So definitely something to consider there as well. And then we've also been experiencing supply chain issues for a while now, not just due to the pandemic, but also the war in Ukraine, the shifts in the climate. So when you add road closures and poor visibility and frozen precipitation to the equation, really that's just another impact on the supply chain that could really cause shortages, of different supplies and areas throughout the winter months. And if you do experience structural or network damage from winter weather, chances are that contractors and repair people, cable, internet providers, those service providers generally have more limited availability and longer wait lists. So it could potentially take days, weeks, or even months sometimes, like we saw in Texas back in 2021, before some of those repairs can even be made. And then just one more not so fun fact, the Harvard Business Review reports that extreme winter weather disrupts the operating and financial performance of 70% of businesses worldwide due to those primary and secondary impacts that we just talked about. So the more prepared, obviously, we can be before those winter season impacts start to hit, the more resilient your company can be when inclement weather actually starts to strike. Okay, so I alluded to some of this earlier, but it's incredibly important. So I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive here. Every organization should really consider how winter weather events are going to impact all different types of workers, right? The pandemic has made us more resilient with people being able to work in different locations, but we also have to think about things differently. So for on-site and in-office employees, how can you keep them safe, throughout their commutes when they're coming to work? You should also be conscious of how well and how often you are winterizing your buildings, sidewalks, parking lots, walkways, all of those things. And then thinking about your plan for workplace power outages while you're present on-site and your workers are present on-site. So those on-site workers. Also big to think about your travelers. Travel is back, a lot more people traveling. Traveling workers may experience inclement weather based on where they're traveling around the globe. So really asking yourself the question of how you can better protect your business travelers, or really prepare them depending on the destination that they're going to. And then we've also talked about remote workers quite a bit. It's definitely an important one. They could obviously experience any number of impacts that we've discussed in their homes, including power outages, the trip slips and falls, frozen pipes, lack of supplies, lack of vendors, and so much more. So definitely a lot to consider there. And then outdoor workers are obviously the most vulnerable to cold stress and injuries and illness at the end of the day when we think about winter weather. So you'll definitely want to evaluate and assess assess their working conditions, even their clothing and their uniforms, and really assess how they can potentially, be in situations where they can get to heat when the winter season begins. And then lastly, we don't want to forget about lone workers, right? Not only do they transport themselves from one place to another while on the job, but they could potentially be working in environments with no heat or icy or snowy conditions. So really helping to minimize the risk for those workers is of the utmost importance. So it's a lot to think about. I know it's a lot to think about. It all is so important, though, especially as we gear up for the winter. Okay, Katie, I think we have another poll that we want to jump into.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a good time to poll the audience now that we've heard all of these great explanations from you both. So please go ahead and take a moment to answer the question on your screen. This time we're asking, which of these scenarios are you least prepared for, or do you feel you're least prepared for as winter approaches? So maybe it's the power or the network outages, protecting workers from cold-related illness and injuries, maybe those limited supplies and vendors Sara was talking about, providing resources for workers experiencing seasonal disorders. Or perhaps it's the energy crisis that could occur, or the rising energy costs that could be associated with that. So with that in mind, I'm just going to give this another moment so you can all get your results in. And then we are going to go ahead and share those results. Okay. So can everyone see these results? Sara, Jason, everybody? Okay, great. So again, all represented here, but it looks like number 1 and number 4, which are network or power outages and seasonal disorders, are kind of neck and neck there for the strongest concerns. So Sara, is that what you expected to see here?
Definitely the outages, and we have data coming out our ears with different things, but we have data that actually shows us that power outages are actually becoming longer. So definitely can understand why there's a concern there. I'm really pleasantly surprised actually to see all the selections for number 4, as we just talked about the importance of mental health. I definitely think it's something we don't always consider with planning. So it's good to see that it's at least top of mind here.
Mm-hmm. Jason, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm also glad that the power outages are pretty high up on the list, because oftentimes that's one of the more widespread issues that are impacting people. Going back to what happened in Texas a couple of years ago, I know that was more of the exception than the rule, but we had several million people lose power during that one singular event. And then we often see hundreds of thousands of people without power across multiple different states at a time for each and every one of these long duration winter storms.
That's a good point. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on now. We'll close out that poll. And now, Jason, can you talk us through some tips on how to prepare and protect people and property? And then Sara can follow up after that with some advice on effective communication during winter weather events. All right, Jason, it's all yours.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So the first thing that we often need to be thinking about really before we get deep into the winter season is to formulate or review that winter preparedness plan now. As we're already seeing within some of the forecast guidance, the pattern's turning colder. We're already seeing major winter events. The situation in Buffalo, you may be starting to hear some news about that, but if you haven't already, you're certainly going to hear about it by the end of this week into this weekend. So we really want to get ahead of these episodes and start to devise where exactly are we going to be before these storms really get going. The last thing you want to do is be trying to travel somewhere and then you get caught up in a snow event that's producing 2 to 3 inches per hour, people getting trapped on the roadways and things like that. So those are all important things that need to be discussed. Communicate your preparedness plan often and with transparency. So the last thing that we really want is to have our customers or employees figure out that there's a winter storm warning, but I really have no idea what that means from a work standpoint. So you can rest assured that they'll feel a lot more comfortable about what actions need to be taken if they have this preparedness plan laid out well in advance. So once they get that weather notification, they know exactly what to do. And basically, you want to send all those winter weather tips and forecasts over to all worker types. So, for example, if you do catch wind that there is going to be a major storm just a couple days out, certainly you want to share that information as quickly as possible. I know that we all have busy things going on in each of our lives, and sometimes the weather forecast is the last of those things that we look at. So sometimes it's really up to us to go ahead and notify our employees. Sometimes reality doesn't set in until they hear it from their employer. So the second that we hear that there is going to be inclement weather, be sure to feel free to share that information and include employees in the discussion to learn about any gaps in preparedness, because you may think that it's a well laid out plan, but the second you share that, there could be some counter feedback that could really find some gaps within that plan and make it more resilient after it's been talked about amongst a group of people. And then finally, encourage your employees to devise their own winter weather preparedness plan, because you're only as valuable as your employees are available. And so basically, if they're caught up with their own family issues when it comes to these events, not being able to take care of their own household, they may not be able to assist in operations during the height of these events. So in terms of other preparedness items, some other things that you may want to consider in terms of protecting your property is to have your structures inspected well in advance. Make those repairs now. For example, if you're up in the Northern Plains or into the Northeast, if you get a 2 to 4 foot snow event, what is the impact going to be if you already have a vulnerable roof? You may not be aware of any leaks to the roofing structure at the moment, but the second you get a major storm like that, really all of those weaknesses are going to become well known. So it's going to be best to have a contractor look into this well before the storms arrive, and that's going to really mitigate the damage, and some of the cost effectiveness will be improved significantly if you have someone look into these things well beforehand. You also want to move and winterize important equipment, and some pain points here, especially in the case of whenever there's a snow emergency declared in a major metro. A lot of times that means you really cannot park your vehicles on city streets, and you really want to devise a plan as to where exactly you're going to place these vehicles in the event of a snow emergency or situation like that. You also want to review your county mitigation plan just to see if there's any local winter weather threat that's specific to your area. In the case of the Great Lakes, lake effect snow events, what are usually some of the things that happen within a particular locale when one of those situations come up? So there's always going to be slightly different variations of the impacts depending on what area you're looking at. And so it's going to be important to look into those county mitigation plans to become more of an expert, so to speak, on those localized issues. And then finally, monitor all weather sites and other resources. So the number one go-to is going to be weather.gov. That's the official website of the National Weather Service. They're going to be the ones that issue all of those winter weather advisories, watches, and warnings. So when in doubt, always refer to them. But as I always say, have a multiple means of receiving watch and warning information. You really want to be the first to receive that info and get those plans going and activated well in advance. And then lastly, become a weather-ready ambassador. And basically all that amounts to is making sure that your company is weather resilient. You've got a well-defined plan in place. And you can also reach out to the National Weather Service and officially become a weather-ready ambassador and get that stamp of approval.
And Jason, before we move on, I have another question here that's relevant to what you're speaking about. So is there you mentioned the resources there. Is there a notification service that is like better than others for organizations to use with their employees? So not just the weather alerts, but also safety notifications, like some of the carbon monoxide points that we made earlier?
Yeah, FEMA Readiness always has great information on their website. They can definitely point you in the right direction as to things to maybe consider before these events take place. That's always a really good one to refer to.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you, Jason and Sarah. I think we're back over to you.
Great. Yeah. And another way you can really help to keep your people and your property and your businesses safe is by proactively monitoring for and identifying severe winter weather. And one way that you can do that is by investing in threat intelligence solutions that really help you and your teams understand the expected impact of a storm, really based on the geographical footprint of your organization. So where are your people? Where are your buildings? Where are your assets? Being able to visualize and see those, and then you can identify emerging threats faster and really respond in real time, being able to do automated impact assessments and warnings. So really kind of a combined solution. Really important to add that having that functionality built into your communications platform is really going to save you time and decrease stress during these critical times. So being able to identify something that could impact your workforce, identifying those events and communicating seamlessly within the same tool can be really, really beneficial during times like this. And then speaking of communication, it's really critical when it comes to winter weather preparedness and response. It's such a key thing for everything, right? But especially when we think about these situations, businesses should obviously be very prepared with ready to send communications to really protect their people during every stage of the storm. So really having that ability to develop pre-built notification templates in your emergency communication system, that's really going to help you save time when it's the most critical. You obviously don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to custom craft a message every time you're trying to communicate to your employees. Obviously, you're going to lose precious time in these situations, and that's not a great thing, right? So before the storm, you can obviously proactively warn your people that a storm is approaching. You can also share urgent information and preparedness advice, depending on the situation. Then it's also important to manage your employees' expectations at this point regarding any new information or updates and how you're going to share those with them. What channels? Is this going to be sent out via email? Is there a company webpage? So it's really essential to be able to provide a way for employees also to ask questions in those situations, requesting more information. That's going to help them to remain kind of calm and less confused and collected during these situations. And then when you think about during the storm, obviously it's really important to check on your people. Surveying is a really great way to do this, and by way of wellness checks and status updates to really assess their safety and their circumstances. You can, of course, then use their responses to divert any resources and really help understand who's capable of working, maybe who's not capable of working, and or being able to support them in different ways with maybe supplies. And then after the storm, you can utilize communication, right, to provide resources and aid to those in need. Like I mentioned, you can survey them with this kind of quick ability, right? If they're remote, you can ask them if they have power or internet. Are they able to focus on the job based on the stress of maybe whatever they're going through at home? Your in-office employees, obviously, great time to be helping them understand what's happening at the office facility, if there's an all clear and folks can return to work, or if there's anything else going on that might impact, say, their commute. So a lot can happen during a storm. So if any facets of the organization are impacted or are not back to normal, it's really, best practice to be transparent with people within your organization, obviously just helping them to understand the path forward. And this is, again, where that two-way communication can be essential. Your employees should have a way to really let you know if they cannot physically get into the office, or maybe if there's power lines down or road closures, black ice, and things like that in their areas. And then you should also have a plan for alternate channels of communication in the event of power outages. Communication through all of these phases, I really believe, is truly key to keeping your employees safe and connected, and really helping you to focus on any recovery efforts if needed during this time. So I think it's also helpful in these situations to talk about real examples, right? Real organizations and real people that are impacted by these sorts of situations. So one great one comes from one of our customers. It's called Austin Pets Alive. They're also known as APA. They're a nonprofit organization that specializes in programs that are designed to save populations of animals that are at risk of euthanasia. So when the Texas storm, Winter Storm Uri, it was called, spread unprecedented snowfall and damaging ice in Texas a few years ago, Austin Pets Alive was one of the many organizations that needed a way to keep their employees safe and informed despite the power outages and the water quality issues and the unsafe driving conditions. So with AlertMedia's multi-channel two-way communication platform, Austin Pets Alive was really able to keep their employees informed about the status of their campus, street closures, the storm's progression. And then as the storm worsened and impacted critical city infrastructure, they also leveraged survey notifications to really check on their employees and determine who was in need of water, who had power, who might have needed supplies. So they were also able to assist one of their employees who was stranded at home without food and supplies, and really help that person through the storm, receiving the supplies that they needed. And by deploying, this rapid multi-channel messaging that Austin Pets Alive did, they were really able to distribute resources to their employees in all of these situations. And then, as you would expect, their employees were obviously incredibly thankful for the communication and the concern for their well-being during and after the storm. And that's just one example, really, of how effective communication, innovative tools can really help support an organization in protecting their employees and their infrastructure during these critical kind of severe weather events. And with that, Katie, I'll go ahead and send it back to you. I think we have another poll.
Excellent. We sure do. Thank you so much, Sara. So we do have some time for audience questions. I'm going to get to those next. But first, I do want to poll our audience just one last time, and this one's going to be quick. So you've now heard from, two of AlertMedia's subject matter experts, Jason and Sara, but we'd love for you to take advantage of our full team of experts. So please just take a moment to let us know, are you interested in learning more about how AlertMedia can help with your winter weather preparedness and communications? You can say yes, and we will get you all the information that you need, or you can say not at this time, and of course, no hard feelings. So I'm going to give that just another minute or so, a second or so, not a minute, don't worry. And I think we can go ahead and close out that poll so we can move on to some questions. And we do have quite a few coming in here. If you haven't submitted, just a reminder, you can use this Q&A function now. All right, Jason, first thing for you. This is in relation to New England. We are seeing more and more storms come in around the freezing mark, which lends to freezing rain and ice rather than snow. And these ice storms present highly hazardous conditions for workers, commuters, and travelers. Can you speak to this trend, and do you have any preventative measures?
Yeah, so I definitely understand the concern there because, as I've alluded to earlier, these ice storm events are oftentimes more serious than the full-blown 2 to 3 foot snow events. And a lot of times we don't really have a good feel for where these freezing rain events are going to set up until the final 12 to 24 hours before the storm event begins. So this is why I'm always really preaching that, especially during these winter months, it's important to keep up with those local forecast changes, even sometimes 2-3 times a day, because you don't know exactly where that freezing rain snow line is going to set up until the day of the event in a lot of situations like that. In terms of the overall storm tracks, they can often vary from season to season. Sometimes we have more coastal to offshore storm tracks, depending on what the pattern is for that particular year. But also it's hard to really define a trend because you can easily revert back and see more inland runner type situations or more out to sea type situations. So I wouldn't get too caught up into, we're always going to see a more increased frequency of freezing rain, sleet versus more so the snow. Really, it's a situation by situation. Situation by situation is going to be basically, determining that storm track 2 to 3 days beforehand. And we haven't really seen too much of a well-defined trend within recent years about freezing rain type versus snow.
Gotcha. Thank you, Jason. Sara, I think this is a good one for you. And I bet a lot of folks have the same question. So I want to ask this one. How do you recommend advocating for more budget to handle winter weather? This sometimes feels like a low priority.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know a lot of companies struggle with budget just in general, but preparedness is obviously really important. One of the kind of best practices that we try and help our customers with and kind of give them information on is data, right? When I think organizations can see what could financially impact them if there isn't that preparedness in place, I think that really hits home. I think also providing data such as the stuff that we presented today, right, is really important so that organizations can see what's expected in the future. I think those are some ways to really encourage, especially, executives and stakeholders as to, giving more allotment of budget for some of this preparedness stuff.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. This one actually isn't a question, it's just a comment, but I love that. Please send in comments or scenarios, anything like that you'd like to share. This person says, sharing that our insurance company provided us with water and temperature sensors to put in all of our buildings. These are monitored on an app, and if a pipe freezes or there's a water leak, it will send us an alert with the location of the alarm. So that's very cool.
That's
something that could be very, very helpful. All right, let's see. Let me go to this one. Jason, do you recommend that company vehicles have snow tires and chains, or does it just depend on the region, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it really depends on the region, but we see that especially in places like the Sierra Nevada mountains up there in central and northern California, especially if you're going through any mountain snowpass areas. In fact, a lot of times that is a requirement in certain parts of the country when there are going to be significant winter storms moving through. So definitely something to consider. But if you're in one of those big snow-prone, heavy snow areas, you may want to check out what the local authorities have to say because there are local restrictions.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to stick with you on this one, Jason. This is kind of specific, but I bet people are curious about it. If your parking lot has sunshade, are they likely to collapse and damage vehicles? Should those parking spaces be closed in snow and inclement weather events?
Yeah, that's a great thought and something that I would definitely consider doing beforehand. I think really people underestimate the weight of this ice and snow, and several times, even not just for the vehicles, but if you have employees, walking in and out of a building during that, sometimes it can be quite dangerous as some of those, blocks of snow and ice begin to melt. You start to see those come off in sheets more often than not. So really the placement of that really matters, and you want to evaluate that well before these systems arrive.
Excellent. Sara, this one's about communication, so I'm going to give it over to you. How do you decide when to alert your employees versus when to hold off? So basically, how can we avoid over alerting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know that organizations are susceptible to that over alerting. You obviously want people to receive information and digest it and really be informed. I think one of the best approaches is to at least alert employees early. So if you know that there's this winter storm that's headed towards Buffalo, really getting in touch with employees early on is always going to be helpful. That way they're expecting the messaging, right? That way, even if there are a number of different messages, they've known for a little while what to expect and that there's going to maybe be a significant amount of communication. And then some organizations obviously will tailor their approach with sending text messages or sending emails, and also allowing their employees to kind of decide how they receive that information, which can also be helpful when you do have to over alert. Because let's be honest, in some of these situations, you will have to send multiple messages.
Well, you actually almost just answered two questions in one, because we got another one asking what the best interface is to communicate. Phones tend to be in everyone's hands. So is that your suggestion? Is that like the quickest, easiest way to reach someone?
Yeah, absolutely. We've definitely become more of a mobile society. I know a lot of people have laptops and most people are sitting in front of a computer all day, but everybody has a cell phone these days. And that's generally the easiest way to get in touch with people. I know we apply our own product with our own employees, and we alert people through text messages and app pushes, just simply because that's their normal mode of receiving information. And it's also something that they're going to receive immediately. A lot of folks are in email, right? But they're not necessarily sitting in it all day long. So in general, text messaging and app pushes can be a little bit more urgent, and people will see them more quickly.
Awesome. We have one other comment I want to read here because this is great. At my company that's located close to Buffalo, we prepare for things like the winter storm incoming with various preparedness techniques, one of which is that we have rooms on reserve at a local hotel to provide a place for workers to go if they are unable to travel home. So I just wanted to read that one out loud. We hear that quite a bit at AlertMedia. It's just an excellent way to sort of mitigate that risk. Sara, Jason, anything to add to that comment?
Yeah, that's great. And it's definitely a good one to call out, because we do see a lot of organizations that do this, especially in, emergency care and facilities where you have to remain staffed either, during certain hours or 24/7. It's really great if you can block off hotel rooms or even work with a hotel chain to get a discount during these times. They're usually not going to be overly populated, but that's a great best practice.
Awesome. Yeah. And then we have time for one. Oh, sorry, Jason.
No, I was just going to piggyback off of that. I would say that that's great advice. And I can't exactly tell anyone what to do, but if I was in the Buffalo area, I would definitely consider that today.
Excellent. So Jason, quick answer if you can. Do you have any preventative measures for dealing with wind in a winter storm?
Yeah, so wind is a big component. That's really one of the reasons why we see as many power outages as we do, especially during the first third of the season where, we might still have a little bit of leftover foliage, and then you've got one of the first big systems of the year coming through. So it's really good to trim back those branches and trees from any, pain points around your building or near utilities, because that'll definitely lessen the risk of localized outages at least.
Awesome. Well, that is all the time that we have for questions. But if you are looking for additional information, we have these resources that we can offer you. So we highly recommend downloading AlertMedia's free winter weather preparation and response checklist, as well as our winter weather communication templates. Again, those are free. You can find them at alertmedia.com with many other free resources. So with that, I just want to thank Sara Pratley and Jason Moreland for joining us today and for sharing their insights and expertise. And Sara, if anybody wants to follow up with you after today's webinar, is this email address the best way to reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. More than happy for folks to reach out on LinkedIn as well. I'm pretty active there too.
All right. Jason, any final thoughts from you or ways to get in touch besides this email?
No, same applies here. You can email me or send me a LinkedIn message, whether it's anything that's forecast related or winter preparedness related. Feel free.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining us today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our attendees did as well. And that does conclude our presentation. So I really hope you all feel at least a little bit more prepared for the approaching winter season. Of course, I want to thank EHS Today for being such an amazing partner and for hosting us here today. And with some final wrap-up info, I'll turn it back over to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you. That was fascinating. On behalf of EHS Today, I'm Dave Blanchard. Stay safe, stay healthy, and take care. Thanks.